The cashier held my card between two fingers as if it had started to smell, looked at the monitor, then at me, and said in a voice that carried across the supermarket queue that my account was restricted pending review by the attorneys. The man behind me sighed and shifted his basket from one hip to the other. A boy giggled, and the cashier offered me the pitying smile you give someone who has lost not only their balance, but their mind. I kept my chin up and asked her to try again, and she did, barely touching the terminal as though any contact might tangle her in the same web that had caught me. When it failed a second time, she tilted her head and said she could hold the items if I preferred, and I told her I would pay in cash. Of course I had cash, because you learn to keep a little tucked away when you're 68 and widowed and still wear your husband's wedding band on a chain. The notes trembled in my hand because I was not just embarrassed but frightened, and because I already knew who had pressed that invisible button. I walked the 4 streets home with my shopping bag heavier than it had any right to be, holding it close not to drop the leeks and bread, but to stop myself from shaking. On Luckwell Road, the neighbor's cocker spaniel barked from behind its gate, and a woman I half knew from the Residents Association gave me that tight smile that says, I heard something, and I'm not sure what to do with it. The wind was clipping at the late afternoon, rattling the lids of the bins, and I placed my key in my own door with the small defiant care of a person who makes a ritual of continued ownership. Inside, the hallway smelled of polish and dust because I had waxed the handrail that morning, the way I always do on the first Tuesday of the month, as if I am quietly keeping a promise to a house that has kept me through storms. On the mat sat a white envelope addressed to my son in my own house, with my street as the address and his name where mine should be, and a return label from a company called Genesis Probate Services. I tucked it beneath my arm as I put the bread away, and when I ran my fingers along the top edge, I felt that familiar flare of anger that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. He must have used your address accidentally, Mum, my daughter-in-law had told me the week before, standing in my kitchen with her coat on, holding her phone flat in her palm like a waiter with a plate he can't wait to set down. Everyone uses our address now. He works from home. It's easier. Don't worry about letters. We've got it all in hand. In hand. She used that phrase often, like a magician showing you the empty right while the left did its work. Tamsin is clean, you know the type, hair that never seems to move, voice always tilted upward in sweet concern like a bell on a bicycle. She says she's just being efficient. She says she's thinking of everyone. She shares Google documents with color-coded headings and calls me lovely twice per conversation. People like her are very good at being the kind of helpful that leaves you poorer and more grateful at the same time. I set the envelope beside my green binder where I keep the house and utility papers because I have been a clerk all my life and order is what I have when people go messy. I'm not fancy. I did 30 years as a school secretary and 10 more part-time for a small engineering company, and in both places people leaned over my desk in January and asked me to remind them of their passwords or print forms their bosses pretended didn't exist. And I always found a way. I can spot a discrepancy in a column from across the room. I can tell when something's off by the weight of the paper. I keep a ledger of money in and out even now, not because I don't trust the statements, but because I trust my own eyes more. That ledger had shown me 2 transfers last month that I hadn't authorized. Small sums, each just under the threshold that prompts a text message, moving from my current account into a linked account, with a reference that meant nothing to me. I had phoned the bank, waited my turn, and spelled my mother's maiden name twice, and they told me there was a standing instruction attached to a registered power of attorney, and I nearly dropped the receiver. That cannot be correct, I said, and the woman said she would make a note and escalate. You should understand, because it matters, that I am not careless. After my husband John died 7 years ago, I handled the probate myself with a solicitor only for the final application. And the house on Luckwell Road is in my name because we paid it off by being boring and steady and saying no to holidays we couldn't afford. My son Daniel and his wife have been helping me since then with the bigger things I don't understand, like the internet tariff or the new smart meter, which makes me sound slow, but I am not slow. I am just not interested in being billed every 15 minutes by an object on the wall. They said I should consider setting up a lasting power of attorney, just in case, and I said we would discuss it, and then the papers never seemed to be quite ready, and then every time I asked there were delays. And once there was a phone call where a woman from somewhere asked if I understood what I was signing, and I said I hadn't signed anything, and she said she was reading from the record, and then it was all very confusing, and Daniel told me not to worry because they had decided to pause the process. People think old means daft. Old often means you pick your battles to keep the peace. You will ask, perhaps, why I didn't shout the first time my son explained that the bank would freeze certain activities for safety. I will tell you that he is my boy, and I have a wound I don't show because a mother would rather swallow her pride than spit her family out on the pavement. That wound lives in the shape of a Tuesday evening 13 years ago when he said I made everything heavier, and I pretended not to hear him. He'd been out of work for a year by then, and his wife was newly pregnant, and I paid their council tax for 1 quarter and never told anyone. He did find work later. The words, though, found a perch inside me and nested there. In the supermarket queue, I felt that weight return, but instead of letting it settle, I pushed it to the side with the edge of my mind, because it was time to put the kettle on and do what I do when something is wrong. I laid the facts out like cutlery. Letter to Daniel at my address from a probate company. 2 small unauthorized transfers described as linked. Cash card declined due to restriction by attorneys. My own knowledge that I had not completed a power of attorney. My daughter-in-law's habit of arranging everything in her phone's notes as if real life is a spreadsheet you can drag to bin. My neighbor Mr. Patel's remark in passing on Sunday that the man in the red van seems to stop here twice a week now. A phrase I had overheard when I went into the living room to ask them if they wanted tea during their last little admin session at my house. Form TR1 and laughter. I learned at school that TR1 is the transfer deed for property. I had not told them I knew that. I also had my green binder. It is labeled in my handwriting with a black marker I keep in a place only I know, because you learn not to tell your family everything. Inside are the deeds, the building's insurance, the receipt from the new boiler, the will I wrote when the grandchildren were born, and we were still one of those families with Sunday roasts and daft little arguments that end in hugs. My will leaves my estate to be divided equally between Daniel and my daughter, Lucy, who lives in Glasgow and calls me every Tuesday without fail. Lucy doesn't like Tamsin because Lucy believes people first and paperwork last, whereas Tamsin believes paperwork can make people into what you need them to be. Neither of them lives in my pocket because I insisted they live their own lives, and perhaps in being proud of that I also put myself further away from sight than is wise. When the kettle clicked off, I opened the Genesis Probate Services envelope. It contained a brochure full of glossy faces and a cover letter thanking Mr. Daniel Barker for his call and outlining their holistic approach to estate planning, and on the second page there was a line that made me sit down. We confirm the draft deed of gift for 14 Luckwell Road will be prepared following receipt of the signed LP1F confirmation, as discussed. The LP1F is the lasting power of attorney for property and financial affairs. I know because I looked it up the last time my son used those letters as if they were nothing but a weather report. I placed the letter gently beside the green binder as if it might bite through the table and fall down into the floorboards and gnaw. I could hear John in my head, that low chuckle that used to steady me on bad days. Steady now, Len. The numbers are there. We just have to see where they are pointing. And I said aloud, to the empty kitchen, that I would be steady. You were out when I called by, said a voice from the front door, and I flinched so hard my tea slopped over the rim. It was Mr. Patel, the retired postmaster who lives opposite and knows more about the comings and goings on this street than the council. He is a kind man whose wife died last year and who has given me basil in a pot twice this summer. He held up another envelope, this one from the GP surgery. This was sticking out of your letterbox. I thought with the rain forecast and that hole in the porch roof. Thank you, I said, wiping the table and my face with the same cloth, because sometimes dignity is just choosing to do ordinary things in order. Do you want a cup of tea? He hesitated at the threshold because we both have that old training about minds and mouths and neighbors, but he stepped in because I have been there for him with frozen meals and lifts to the library, and he is not blind to what is happening. He looked at the white brochure on my table as he took the cup and pretended not to look, which is the most thoughtful kind of looking. He told me he had new bird feed if the sparrows kept tearing at my plants. He told me he had seen the red van again at lunchtime, parked too close to my gate, and a woman in a smart coat had taken a photograph of my house number. I put the Genesis packet away under the binder and thanked him for the basil again. When he left, he glanced over his shoulder, and in that glance I saw the thing he could not bring himself to say because men like him do not intrude, that he was worried. I went into the sitting room where the light comes in low in the afternoon and shows up everything you haven't dusted. On the mantel was the photograph of my children at the beach their father loved, and in front of it was the small brass key on a ribbon I found in John's toolbox a week after he died. He used to call it his rainy day key, and when I asked to what he laughed and said, "It's the key to you not worrying if something goes wrong," and wouldn't say more. I tried it in every lock in the house that first month like a puzzle and it fit none, and eventually I threaded it on the ribbon and told myself that perhaps he had been teasing me, which he sometimes did to make me stop fretting. Now, looking at the shine of that silly key, I felt a pull like a thread tugged from the back of a jumper. I pulled the step stool from the pantry, climbed up to the top of the wardrobe where we keep what my granddaughter calls the old stuff, and pulled down the shoebox where the rest of John's papers live. Inside were gas bills from a decade ago, his army pay book, a faded copy of our mortgage agreement, and an envelope marked in his careful square hand, in case of interference. I stood with it between my fingers for a full minute because grief is not one thing. It is a color that washes back over you when you least expect it and makes you younger and older at the same time. Then I opened it. The envelope held a single sheet of paper and a USB stick. The paper was a letter John had written when he was ill and refused to be dramatic about dying. He had anticipated, not our son perhaps, but the ordinary threat that comes to older people when younger ones mean well or mean otherwise. He had written that the house was mortgage-free and that if anyone tried to place it at risk through financial products or gifts, I was to speak to Mr. Gareth Lowe at Kennett and Lowe Solicitors. There was a card stapled at the bottom and remind him of the deed of variation we discussed. The letter also explained that he had set up a do not register restriction with the land registry that required a solicitor's certificate before any transfer could be completed. I had not known. Because sometimes love is a kind of arrogance where you think you will outlive all the problems. On the bottom in a lighter, shake your hand, he had added, USB contains scans of all relevant forms and letters, plus the key. The key? I looked at the brass ribbon thing on the mantel and laughed, once, out loud and with something like relief, because it turns out he had not been teasing me. I plugged the USB stick into the back of the television because I knew better than to insert strange things into the computer my granddaughter uses for her schoolwork when she visits, and the folder opened to show scans and a photograph of a small black box I did not recognize. I recognized, though, a file labeled Land Registry Restriction Confirmation, and a letter signed by G. Lowe confirming that no transfer of 14 Luckwell Road could occur without a solicitor certifying that I had not been pressured and that I had received independent legal advice. The files were date-stamped 6 years ago. He had done this quietly and entirely in his own understated way, and for a moment I sat very still because love is a safety net you do not see until you fall. My phone pinged. It was a family group message, the one Tamsin renamed last year Barker's on Task, as if we were a brand. She had sent a smiling photograph of their dining table covered in papers. "Sorting through life admin tonight," she wrote. "So grateful for systems. Mom, so you're clear, we'll arrange that appointment the bank suggested. So much easier if we consolidate accounts. We can collect your statements tomorrow to save you the trip. Shouldn't be a faffex. I prefer to handle my own statements," I typed, and then I deleted it because I have learned that a small no is sometimes more effective than a large speech. I wrote instead, "Come for tea at 4. I'll have the binder ready," and I let the 4 stand like a little fence. I set my phone down and picked up the solicitor's card from John's letter and traced the number with my finger. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I called. The receptionist answered with that grandly calm voice that makes you picture a clock that never slips. When I said my name, there was a pause, and then she transferred me immediately. A man with a soft Welsh lilt came on the line and said he knew my husband and my insides went hot then cold because the dead are not supposed to walk through the telephone like that. He remembered John. He remembered the restriction. He told me that if anyone tried to register a transfer without the proper certificate, the land registry would simply reject it and notify me, but he added that people sometimes are not trying to register, they're trying to set the pieces for later. Deeds of gift drawn but unsigned, bank accounts moved into new structures, and that it was wise to gather originals and keep them where hands cannot wander. He asked after me. He asked after the house. It felt like someone opening a window. If you can come by, he said, bring whatever correspondence you've received, and if anyone is pressing you to sign, do not sign. There's also such a thing as a capacity certificate. Only a doctor can speak to it. Not a relative. Not a helpful daughter-in-law. Helpful daughter-in-law, I repeated, because sometimes saying the words out loud makes you see their shape. Yes, she is very helpful. I thanked him, and we made an appointment for Thursday, and I hung up and sat in the dimming room with the brass key in my hand and the Genesis brochure under the binder and the solicitor's card under the magnet shaped like a tomato on the fridge. I drank my cold tea and felt something in my chest loosen, not a release. Not yet, but a shift like a tide turning. I spent the next hour doing the kind of invisibly clever work no one applauds. I took photographs of every document and emailed them to a new address I made just then, because if I have learned anything in a life of filing it, is that 2 copies are better than 1. I wrote down the dates I had noticed on the bank transfers and printed the screenshots. I put the originals of my will and the deeds in a zipped pouch and placed it at the bottom of the laundry basket beneath the towels because no one looks under clean, folded domesticity. I made lemon bars because Daniel likes them and I am not above sugar to soften the mouth that means to bite me. I cleaned the kettle. I threw away the brochure and then I took it back out of the bin because evidence is evidence however it stinks. I went out to the porch to check if the postbox hinge had loosened again, and when I opened the door the evening air felt colder than it should. Across the road, Mr. Patel stood on his path with his phone in his hand in an odd half-raised way. He is not a man who films, he is a man who watches. He looked embarrassed to be caught looking and stepped over, the way you do when you've already chosen to interfere because decency insists. I was going to pop this through in the morning, he said, holding his phone but not offering it. Only I thought, perhaps now. He showed me the screen. The video was from his door camera, the sort that the younger families install because they like to know when their parcels arrive. The timestamp said 14:12. The red van was at my gate. A woman in a pale coat stepped out, carrying a folder. She walked up my path, bent, and lifted my doormat as if she owned it, then slid a flat packet beneath it. She looked around, briskly, and then she took a quick photograph of my front door with her phone and left. The camera captured her face as she glanced across the road. It was Tamsin. I didn't know if I should show you, he said, his voice low as if the pavement had ears. It might be nothing. Only I thought perhaps you should have it. If I'm wrong, forgive me. My mouth dried. I swallowed and I said, could you send that to me, please? And he nodded and pressed his thumb, and the blue arrow lit up and the video landed in my messages, and the woman in the pale coat kept being herself on the screen. I stepped back inside, found the mat more neatly aligned than it usually is after my own feet pass over it, lifted it, and took up the packet. It was an A4 document wallet with a transparent front. Inside, I could see the title page of a deed, the letters as fat and final as if someone had carved them into wood, deed of gift, 14, Luckwell Road. Beneath, in a smaller font, my name. There was a signature line with a neat diagonal line already drawn on it as a placeholder. A yellow sticky note was attached to the front page with a single line in a handwriting I recognized from birthday cards. Mum, pop your signature here and we'll sort the rest. TXX and a smiley face. I held that packet in both hands and felt, very distinctly, the moment when you stop being afraid of being a burden and begin to understand that sometimes leaning into the accusation is the only way to stay standing. I walked back to the kitchen and slotted the packet into the green binder under a tab I labeled, with a small tremor of dark humor, gifts I didn't choose, and then I sent the video to my daughter with the message, "Don't call yet. Come Thursday if you can. Tell no one inch," and I knew that I had just taken a step I could not untake. At 4 o'clock the next afternoon, I will open the door to my son and his wife as if nothing is amiss, as if lemon bars are the currency of trust. And I will watch their eyes when I take out the green binder and the brass key and the solicitor's card and the packet from beneath the mat. But before that evening, I received a message I did not expect from someone I had never thought would risk anything for me. It was from my granddaughter, Eva, who is 14 and usually speaks to me in memes and breathless, unpunctuated stories about her friends, and who in the family pecking order answers to her mother more than to any truth. "Gran, please don't tell Mom I sent this," she wrote, and attached a photograph taken over a desk in her mother's home office. The photo showed a list titled "Plan for Friday, Sign and Lodge Before Capacity Assessment," and beneath it, numbered, were tasks including collect Mom's passport, take keys, and call surgery cognitive test. At the bottom, in small letters, were the words "TR1 at yours, Mr. Browning to witness." My granddaughter had sent a small, shaking torch beam into the dark. The light landed on a word I knew too well and a plan I hadn't yet seen. I looked at the photograph again until the letters swam, and then I looked at the brass key on my kitchen table, and in that pairing the shape of something I might manage to do began to form in me like a tide coming in. I had one more look at the packet and at the video and at John's letter, and I put the binder away and the lemon bars on a plate, and I stood in the doorway to the sitting room where the evening light was thin to its last. From outside, faintly, I heard the red van pass again, slow as a thought. I took a breath and felt my hands steady, because Thursday, I thought, was farther away than I needed it to be, and tomorrow was already filling with other people's plans, and tonight there was something else I could do, something small and precise that would change who knew what and when. If only I could find the right place to put the key. I picked up the brass key, the ribbon cool and worn, and I went upstairs to the loft hatch where the old suitcases live and the boards creak with the memory of our children padding about in pajamas, and I pressed the key at the edge of the hatch where the paint is thicker. And something clicked in a place I had not realized it could, and the panel shifted slightly under my fingers, revealing a narrow cavity the builders had left and that John had reinforced into a hidden shelf. My heart tapped against my ribs, not with fear, but with that strange, electric hope you feel when a plan arrives fully formed. Inside the cavity was a small black fireproof box with a keyhole the size of the brass key's nose. On top of it lay a folded page, the ink faded to brown, in John's hand. "If they ever try to take what you kept alive, use this first." I slid the brass key into the lock and held my breath as if breath were a currency I shouldn't spend. The lid lifted without a sound, and what lay inside made me sit back hard on the landing, my breath leaving me entirely, because in the velvet-lined tray lay not only our original deeds and a certified copy of the restriction, but also a crisp, unopened letter from my doctor dated last month addressed to me and copied to Daniel. Request for capacity assessment deferred, no clinical indication. I didn't even know a copy had been sent to him, and I didn't know the doctor had already written that he saw no reason for a test. Underneath, in a plain envelope without a label, lay something even stranger. A bank cashier's check from 6 years ago made out to me for an amount that could pay for a solicitor for as long as I needed, drawn on an account I had never seen. With a memo line in John's neat print, "Rainy day." My throat made a sound like a laugh and a sob both. I put the check back as if it were made of glass, and I closed the lid, and I thought that perhaps my husband had won the first move of a game I had not known we were playing until now. And then my phone buzzed again, and it was Tamsin, cheerful as a bell, confirming tea tomorrow. I swallowed, smoothed my hair as if she could see me through the roof, and replied with a single line, because it is possible to be both an ordinary woman with lemon bars and the keeper of a quiet storm. For a clock is fine. I clicked the lid shut and tucked the box back into its hidden cradle and slid the panel into place so that the attic looked empty and dull and harmless. And then I carried the binder down to the kitchen and placed it on the table with the lemon bars and the solicitor's card, and I put Mr. Patel's video in a folder on the USB and labeled it Eva's Lantern. Because sometimes you name things to honor the courage it took to bring them to you. And when I finally turned out the light, I stood at the bottom of the stairs listening to my house cradle its night sounds, the timber breathing, the radiator ticking down, the street outside softening, the red van gone for now. I slept with my phone on the pillow beneath my cheek like a child. In the morning, when I went out to sweep the porch, there was a second packet under the mat, thinner than the first and secured with an elastic band, and tucked under the elastic, as if left by a friend and not a thief, was a spare key to my own front door, one I hadn't seen since the winter we lent it to the builders. It was taped to a note in a different hand than Tamsin's, older, scratchier, more impatient, with a single sentence that made my blood go cold and hot at once. "Be ready by noon, Mum. We'll do it before you have time to get confused." I went inside, placed the new packet next to the old in the green binder, slid the door chain in place for the first time in years, and dialed a number I had not dialed since John died, because the friend who had given it to us once said he hoped I'd never need it. When he answered and gave his name, I told him it was time to earn the favor he had offered my husband 7 summers ago. He didn't ask for explanations. He said he would come by at 11:30 with a document camera and an empty witness line. And when I hung up, a small part of me, the clerk who has always kept the ledgers neat, smiled because I had the names of their witnesses and soon I would have something else. What I did not have, not yet, was a plan for where to stand when the bell rang at noon and my son tried to take my keys from my own hand, and whether I would be strong enough to keep my face calm when my granddaughter looked at me with apologies in her eyes. But I had the brass key and the black box and the check and Mr. Patel's video and a solicitor who remembered my husband and a letter from my doctor and an appointment for Thursday and a sentence on Tamsin's list that had given me the edge of a way to turn their own careful order into my proof. And as I wiped the table one more time and straightened the lemon bars in the tin, someone knocked at the door, not with the impatient staccato of my daughter-in-law, but with a single firm rap. When I opened it, a familiar face from the school where I had worked for 3 decades stood there in a raincoat, holding a brown envelope marked safeguarding. And what she told me on the step was the first sign that my quiet little storm might become a thing my whole street would feel. "Mrs. Barker, I came because someone lodged a concern about you," she said, lowering her voice, and her eyes were kind and fierce both. "Only the date on the letter is wrong. And the signature isn't mine." She stood in my hall with damp hair and a school lanyard and said she could only talk in general terms because of data protection. And I said she could sit at my kitchen table as a friend because I had poured squash for her kids after sports day more times than either of us could count, and because I had been the one who flagged a welfare concern for a child whose lunch went missing every week, and she had thanked me for it, and after that she set the envelope down and told me someone had emailed the school, as a neighbor, to say I was wandering at night and leaving my door open and that there were concerns about me forgetting pans on the hob. But the camera on my porch shows my door shut and my pans know their place, and the signature on the form giving permission to share concerns with my GP was a photocopy of hers cut from a letter she had written 2 years ago about Year 6 SATs. And she showed me the printout with the crimped edge where the scissors had caught, and I felt a small cold clarity settle in my stomach, because when people copy signatures they leave the same menacing flourish, and you do not need a handwriting expert to see the laziness. She said the school had followed procedure and logged it, but her head teacher had flagged the odd date and the mismatch in font and asked her to speak to me directly before anything got sent on. And she added that she knew me to be precise about kettles and calendars and that this smelled wrong, and we left it at that because she could not accuse a parent of forging anything without evidence that would stand. And because she is careful and understands systems and how they can be turned against you. We agreed that she would write a note for her head teacher recording the discrepancy, and that if any further concerns were sent from my house she would treat them with more scrutiny, and she squeezed my forearm in an unschool manner before she left. And in that squeeze there was more solidarity than I had received from my own family in a year. At 11:30 the favor arrived, wearing a raincoat and carrying a small flat case the size of a book. Alan Reed used to run the housing office when everyone's still queued with paper tickets and has since won himself a seat on the council. And he had once asked John to fix a mess with a planning application in our old street, and John did it on a Saturday morning and refused payment, so Alan owed us one. And in my kitchen, he put the case on the table and took out a document camera with a flexible neck and set it up so that it looked down at my chairs like a watchful eye. He asked me if I wanted to record sound as well, and I said I did, because I was not a fool and because I knew that even if the police never heard it, a solicitor would, and he nodded and showed me the red light when the microphone was live. He advised me not to rise to provocation, not to sign anything, not to hand over original identification, to ask them to email any documents so I had a timestamp, to take photographs of anything they put in front of me, and to say it all out loud so that the record captured that I was calm and understood what I was being asked to do. He said a deed of gift is not a shopping list and that a lasting power of attorney cannot be used without my signature and a certificate provider who has seen me and is not in their pocket, and that there is no such thing as a family activation of an LPA because banks still look for the sealed office of the public guardian registration and even then have internal checks for vulnerable customers, and that if someone had told the bank otherwise, they were bluffing with confidence. He told me to remember the words, independent legal advice, and he nipped out to put his car around the corner because he did not want them to know he was there. The first humiliation came early and small, and it still managed to sting. At 11:45 there was a knock from Mr. Patel, who handed me a parcel that had been misdelivered and carried a sticker that said, "Property Pack Urgent." He apologized for reading the label over the sorting desk, where he sometimes helps for the social part, and because he worries about the way couriers leave expensive items on front steps. And I told him it was fine, and I placed the parcel on the dresser because I knew if I opened it, I might not be able to keep my face steady later. He lingered and told me that on the street WhatsApp someone had posted that an ambulance had been seen in our road last week and that we all needed to check on our older neighbors. And he looked ashamed as he said it because he had already checked on me and the ambulance had been 2 doors down for a boy with asthma. But the damage done by a vague message is not always fixable, especially when people enjoy the warm feeling of vague concern more than they enjoy the cold sensation of proof. When he left, he touched his brow in a way that made me want to cry, and I did not, because I had a camera recording. They came earlier than the note promised, and that was the second small blow, because it meant they wanted to catch me in my ordinary state before I had time to think. At 11:57 the bell rang, and I saw the shape of my son through the frosted glass, and beside him a man I recognized from the estate agent on the high street who once told me my house would fly if I ever wanted to sell. And just behind them the pale outline of a woman with a clipboard and a badge on a lanyard that caught the light as she moved. I unlatched the chain and opened the door, and Daniel stepped forward to kiss my cheek as if nothing in the world was strange, and said I was looking well and that he had popped by earlier than planned so we could get the boring bits over before tea because he knew I had my routines and he did not want to disturb them, and that word bored me of him a little because he uses it to describe anything that is not about him. The man from the estate agent introduced himself as Mr. Browning and said he was only here to witness a signature, nothing more, and the woman with the clipboard said she was a nurse practitioner from the private clinic and that she would like to do a short cognitive screening while we had tea, nothing invasive, just a chat. Lots of families do it for peace of mind, and Tamsin, who arrived a moment later with a plastic folder and brisk breath, said we would all feel better once it was done, and could we sit in the kitchen because the light is better there. I said the kitchen would be fine because I wanted the camera to catch their faces and because I wanted the microphone to hear their practiced phrases. And I carried the lemon bars in and set them on the table next to the green binder and asked Daniel if he wanted tea, and he said yes please, and did not look at the binder because he has learned to avoid the places where truth collects. The nurse explained that the screening would record my orientation to time and place and asked me to remember 3 words, and I remembered 7 for my own comfort and let her choose which 3 she needed. And when she asked me to draw a clock, I drew the school bell I had set for 30 years at midday and labeled it with the date and the street and the name of the Prime Minister, because I have always known names even when I wished not to. And when she asked me to subtract 7s from A 100, I did so aloud in a voice that did not rise, And when she asked me how I might manage my affairs if I could no longer do so, I answered that I would appoint attorneys of my choosing after taking independent legal advice. And I watched out of the corner of my eye as Tamsin wrote something down without allowing the nurse to see her page. The nurse's expression did not change because she is used to families inserting themselves into assessments, but she did pause before ticking a box, and I stored that pause like a coin. Mr. Browning placed his folder on the table and slid out a document headed TR1 and said he would prefer to do this after the nurse had finished so as not to cause confusion. And I said I was not confused and that they may as well show me what they had brought since we were all here and the tea was hot. And Tamsin smiled with her lips pressed together and said there was no rush and that she had tried to spare me a trip to the solicitor by arranging for a witness to the deed of gift at home because it was the modern way, and she slid the deed across to me with the yellow sticky note still attached, but now written over with an arrow pointing at the line where my signature should go, and she added a fresh note that said, "Sign here, Mum," as if I could not read. And Daniel had the grace to look at the lemon bars instead of my face. I said it was strange to see a transfer deed and a deed of gift in the same folder and asked who had prepared them, and Mr. Browning said the probate services company was handling it all and that he had only been asked to witness and that he was doing a favor to a good client and that it was entirely normal to pre-sign in readiness for registration. And the nurse cleared her throat and said she preferred to finish her screening before anyone put a pen near me, and I nodded at her and said I agreed, and Tamsin's nostrils flared almost invisibly, and that was when my granddaughter slipped in behind them, having walked from school, and stood in the doorway with her satchel and a very straight back and eyes that did not look at her mother because she had already chosen where she would stand and she was terrified of her own choice. The humiliation that cut most deeper than the card at the supermarket came next, and it did not involve money or documents, but a sideways glance. Daniel turned to Eva and said she should give me a hug and thank me for helping with the forms because families who work together stay together. And he said it as if my consent were a foregone conclusion and my part in their plan a kindness I could not refuse without becoming the difficult one, and he did it in front of a stranger to make it real. And I watched my granddaughter's face tighten like a pulled thread and I felt my jaw ache. I poured tea and told Eva to sit beside me and asked about her maths test, and she said it was fine, and then stopped speaking because she has learned that safety lives in small talk, and under the table her knee knocked mine, and I knew that she was shaking. When the nurse finished, she said there was no clinical indication for a formal capacity assessment, and that if anyone required one they should approach my GP with reasons beyond convenience. And she said it briskly into the middle of the room so that the microphone would catch it and Mr. Browning would hear it and the witness in the doorway to my pantry would hear it too, and in that sentence the first small victory of the day took shape. And then it was gone because Tamsin said the GP had already agreed in principle and would I be able to attend on Friday, and she said it with the air of someone offering a manicure, and I wondered how she had learned to make demands sound like treats. And Daniel added that it would not take long and that Mr. Browning could still witness today and lodge the documents for our peace of mind, and I looked at the camera neck and saw the red light steady and bright. I said I was grateful for their concern, that I understood the weight of the documents they had brought, and that I would not sign anything without independent legal advice, and that I had an appointment on Thursday with Kennett and Lowe. And that if Genesis Probate Services had prepared papers without confirming that advice, they were acting beyond their brief, and Mr. Browning shifted his feet and asked if the solicitor had a conflict, and I said he did not, and Tamsin's cheeks flushed faintly as if she had not expected me to produce a name and a date. And Daniel's mouth worked as if searching for a softer route that no longer existed. The nurse put her forms into her bag and said she would send me a copy of her notes, and I thanked her and asked her if she would confirm in writing that no immediate concern had been found, and she said she would. And that sentence did more to steady me than any lemon bar. They tried another angle and it had been prepared for me in my absence, and it was delivered with the measured friendliness of someone selling a timeshare. Tamsin took out a printout from the bank and explained that they had set up a managed account for me that would allow them to help with bill payments, and that it would simplify my life, and that the bank had assured them it was normal for families. And she slid a form called third-party mandate across to me with a sticky note already attached pointing at the signature box, and I told her I had never agreed to that, and that third-party mandates were revocable and limited and did not transfer control of accounts, and that the standing order she had arranged for small transfers to the linked account would stop today. And in saying this, I learned the perimeter of my own temper and decided to keep it inside the fence until I needed it most. I asked her for the account name of the linked account, and she said it was a staging account to consolidate payments, and I said those words did not make sense, and she looked at Daniel, and he said that everything would be easier if I stopped being stubborn and trusted them. And he looked at Mr. Browning to see if a stranger would validate him, and found only a face trying not to be caught in the middle of a family quarrel in a small kitchen. The social pressure came like menopause heat, unexpected and sudden and seemingly from nowhere if you didn't know what to look for. My phone pinged with a message from the residents group asking if I needed lifts to appointments because someone had heard that I was no longer driving, and I have not driven for a decade, and so the timing of the message was not an accident but a reinforcement. And the nurse glanced at my phone and then at Tamsin, and then pretended to check her watch, and the man from the estate agent asked to use the toilet, and I said he could, and he did not find the deeds where I had placed them because he did not know he was not supposed to be looking, and Alan in the pantry lifted an eyebrow and mouthed that he had it all, and I kept my eyes on my son because for all his talk he is an impatient man and men like him reveal themselves when asked to wait. I decided then to lean into the accusation they had prepared for me, because sometimes you turn the weight someone meant to throw at you into your anchor. I said that as I got older I had found money management tiring and that I would welcome help if I could rely on it to be honest and in my interest, and I watched Tamsin's face brighten because she thought she had me. And I asked Daniel to explain what exactly they planned to do with my house if I signed the deed today, and he said they would place it in a family trust for asset protection and efficiency, and that it would not change anything for me, and that they could ensure my right to live here. And I asked him who the trustees would be, and he said he and Tamsin would be the initial trustees with the power to appoint others as needed. And I asked whether my daughter would be a trustee, and he said she was too far away to be practical, and that we could always involve her later, and that later never comes in these arrangements. And I asked who advised them, and he said Genesis and a man at the bank who understood these things, and whose name he could not quite remember, and I asked whether he knew that gifts made to avoid future care fees can be challenged by the local authority under deprivation of assets rules, and that trusts do not magically protect assets from all claims. And his mouth tightened, and he said this wasn't about care fees, but about helping me, and in that moment I saw the pride that would ruin him because he could not concede that I knew anything he did not. I asked Mr. Browning to confirm that before any transfer, he would require a solicitor's certificate confirming independent advice, and he said he was only witnessing and lodging and that he trusted Genesis to comply with whatever was necessary. And I asked if he would sign an acknowledgement that he had seen me told him that I had been advised not to sign and that I had not signed in his presence, and he refused politely because he knows his professional boundaries, and Alan in the pantry coughed softly because he had recorded it anyway. The nurse said she needed to be going and asked if I had any concerns, and I said I did. And I described the misused school signature and the forged permissions and the unknown linked account and the letter from the probate company addressed to my son at my address and the packet under my doormat and the planned capacity assessment noted in my granddaughter's photograph. And I watched her eyes as each piece landed, and she said that while she could not intervene in family financial arrangements, she was obliged to raise a safeguarding concern if she suspected coercion, and that she would make a note to that effect in her file, and Tamsin's hand clenched on her pen and her smile sharpened, and she changed the subject to lemon bars. I had a small one I did not expect, because I had prepared for the wrong battle and still managed to land a blow. I told Daniel that I had decided to trial a third-party mandate with weekly caps if he would agree to email every action to me and to Lucy and to use only my existing account and not any staging account, and that we would review it in a month after I had visited my solicitor, and that if he refused I would revoke all permissions. And he hesitated because a partial win was better than none for him, and because he did not know that I would revoke it anyway after recording his reaction, and he said, That was fine for now and that we were making progress, and he looked pleased with himself, and I thought of the restriction at the land registry and the black box in the loft, and the check John had left, and let him think he had gained a foothold while I built a staircase. The nurse left, and Mr. Browning checked his phone and said he had another appointment and asked again whether I could sign something today to save everyone time. And I said no, and that I would take legal advice on the papers, and that if he left a card I would write to him with my solicitor's details, and he left a card and a look of relief. And Tamsin walked him out, and I heard her say quietly that he should come back in an hour because she thought I would calm down, and the red van idled at the curb with a driver who pretended to text while watching my house, and Mr. Patel stood on his path with his phone in his pocket and his jaw working as if he were chewing a hard sweet, and Eva picked up a lemon bar and bit into it and did not taste anything. And Daniel leaned forward with his elbows on his knees like a boy again and asked me to reconsider because he hated seeing me anxious, and I told him I was not anxious, I was alert. And that word put a hairline crack in his certainty because he had not expected precision. They tried a last turn of the screw, and it was both petty and cruel. Tamsin returned with her voice full of patience and said she had taken my spare key last month for safekeeping and forgotten to tell me, and that she would keep it on her ring because it saved everyone trouble. And she placed it on the table and then drew it back quickly as if testing me and said I should not use the chain on the door because emergency services need access, and she said it with the tone of someone offering advice and not a command. And I told her thanks and slid the chain across. Anyway, because it was my door and my chain and my right, and I think the small metal click was louder than it needed to be. Daniel stood and said he would call the GP to confirm Friday, and I said I would call the GP myself, and he said he had already spoken to them as my representative, and I said he was not my representative, and he said I was being stubborn. And I said that stubbornness had paid his council tax once upon a time and I regretted it, and he looked as if I had slapped him even though I had simply named a truth, and he said I was ungrateful, and I said I was surviving. They left with polite words and tense shoulders and the smell of lemon and paper in the hall, and I closed the door and leaned against it not because I was exhausted, but because I wanted to feel the weight of my house hold me up. And then I called Lucy and told her only what she needed to know and asked her to get on an early train on Thursday, and she said she would, and she said she had booked a second appointment for me with a different solicitor in case the first could not take me, and I realized that while one child would like to move me like furniture to fit his life, the other would show up and carry the heavy end without being asked. I sat down to write an account of the morning while it was fresh, because details fade, and I knew that if I wrote yellow sticky note with arrow today, I would not forget that arrow tomorrow when someone told me I had imagined it. And while I wrote, my phone pinged with a text from the bank thanking me for activating assisted access, and I called immediately and waited through the options and the piano music and told the young man my name and date of birth and mother's maiden name and postcode, and that I had not activated anything, and he checked and said a third-party mandate had been added with my son as the agent, and I said I had not signed it, and he said it had been processed online via a video appointment. And I asked for a copy of the recording, and he said he would raise a request, and I asked him to freeze all third-party access pending my complaint, and he said he could place a hold for 72 hours. And I asked for a vulnerable customer flag to be added noting suspected coercion, and he did it. And then I asked him to read me the reference of a pending transfer scheduled for Friday, and he said there was a pending transaction to Genesis probate client account for an initial fee, and I asked him to cancel it, and he said he could not cancel transfers scheduled by a mandate without written instruction by me, and I asked him to note that instruction while I emailed a signed letter to the complaints team, and I hung up and sent the letter and copied Lucy and Gareth Lowe, and I wrote the reference number in my ledger in capital letters because numbers do not lie even when people do. There was a short lull, and then the next blow landed where I could not block it. A letter with a windowed envelope slid under my door bearing the logo of the land registry, and I opened it with a feeling I would rather not describe and read that an application had been received to register a restriction removal on my title, and that under practice guidelines a party claiming an interest could object within the deadline provided, and I held the paper and felt heat in my face because someone had tried to lift the barrier John had put in place and had done it with enough knowledge to file the right form, and the daylight seemed thinner in the room not because the sky had changed, but because my tolerance had reached its limit. And then I read the applicant name, and it was Genesis Probate Services. And the letter said the application had been returned because the required solicitor's certificate was missing, and I let out a long breath I did not know I was holding and then steadied myself, because a returned application is not an abandoned plan. It is a plan that we'll try again with the right paperwork, and the deadline for objection was still printed on the page, and I would not waste it. I sent a scan of the land registry letter to Gareth and asked him to put a caution on any future attempt to remove the restriction without my written instruction, and he replied within 10 minutes with a short, calm note confirming that he had already contacted the caseworker and that nothing would move without me, and he asked me to bring the letter on Thursday. And for the first time that day I allowed myself to feel tired, because carrying your own defense is work, not drama. The social world pressed again in a different way. A woman from the Residents Association texted asking whether I had considered moving to a bungalow in a retirement development that her friend was selling, and that it would be nice to have more people your age around. And it was dressed as concern, and it was a sales message, and it came not from my life, but from theirs. And I replied that I had lived here for 38 years, and I liked my stairs, and she sent a thumbs up, and within 10 minutes Mr. Browning posted a photograph of a cheery bungalow with a caption about ideal for downsizers, and I closed the app because I would not be baited. The doorbell rang, and everything that had been spread across the morning gathered itself into one sharp point at my door. Through the frosted glass, I saw the pale shape of a woman with a clipboard and the blocky silhouette of a man with a courier bag, and behind them I heard the low idle of the red van and the faint click of a phone camera from somewhere across the road. And before I could stand, the bell rang again, shorter and more insistent, and a voice called through the letterbox that they had come to collect the signed deed of gift and the transfer form, and that if I handed them over now they would make sure Mr. Browning could lodge them before close of business. The voice through the letterbox said they were only couriers and that they had no interest in anything except the envelope marked for Genesis, which was an odd sentence to use at a stranger's door. And I answered by saying that any document from my house would leave my hand only after my solicitor confirmed receipt of his email to me and after I took a photograph of every page, and that if they wished to wait on the pavement they were welcome to enjoy the September air. The chain stayed across. I placed my phone on the sideboard with the speaker on so Alan's document camera would record clearly, and I spoke one deliberate sentence at a time so the audio would carry the shape of consent and refusal in a way even a manager at a bank could not misunderstand. They knocked twice more, and then left a card that had no company registration number on it, which I photographed front and back, and through the frosted glass I saw the courier hand the clipboard to Tamsin, who had been standing to the side. And she turned the card over once in her fingers like she was checking the weight of it, and then slid it into her coat pocket and walked off without looking back at my door. The house felt steady for the first time in days, as if the walls had accepted that the worst thing you can do to a bully is ask them to write down what they are doing, and I used the quiet to move the next pieces of the plan I had not known I was capable of making. I called Kenneth and Lowe and left a message for Gareth confirming Thursday at 10 and describing the card, the nurse's remarks about capacity, the land registry letter, and the scheduled transfer to the probate client account. And I asked them to send an immediate holding letter by email to Genesis and to Mr. Browning stating that I had instructed them, and that any presentation of documents for registration or lodging absent the solicitor's certificate would be treated as a safeguarding concern. I called my GP's receptionist and asked her to place on my notes the entry about the deferred assessment, and she read me the line I had found in the black box and confirmed that no appointment had been booked for me on Friday, despite the family's plans. And when she asked gently whether I felt under any pressure, I told her I was calm and alert and would be bringing written evidence to a solicitor who might contact the practice, and she thanked me in that very careful way good receptionists use when they recognize the difference between fuss and fact. I wrote a subject access request email to Genesis in plain language asking for all data held about me, including call recordings, internal notes, email correspondence with third parties about 14 Luckwell Road, and any drafts of deeds or instructions bearing my name, and I copied myself and Gareth because I wanted a timestamp that no one could move. I did the same to my bank's complaints team and included the reference number from my ledger and the phrases the young man had used about a video appointment and a third-party mandate. And I asked for the copy of the recording and the IP addresses used during the online process and the names of any staff who had actioned it. And I did not soften the request with apologies for inconvenience, because the cost of kindness to the wrong person is paid later at the counter with your own card. I printed the letters and slid them into a plastic wallet with a note on the front in my hand that said SARS sent 1742, because paper makes lies heavier to lift. At 6 there was a knock from Mr. Patel with a container of dal and a face that tried for ordinary and landed on worried, and I let him in and showed him the card and the nurse's badge on the video and the list from my granddaughter and the sticky note. And his mouth made the thin line men make when they wish they could do more than offer food. He told me he had asked his nephew to pull the doorbell footage into a file for me and that the nephew had spotted the red van driver filming my hallway when the door was opened by a few inches and that he had captured the number plate and could write it on a piece of paper if I didn't want it in a text, and in that choice I heard the old sense of safety that says digital can vanish, but pencil on paper in a tin under a towel will be there when the router sulks. I took the paper and put it under the tea towels, and I thanked him in a way that felt insufficient and true. He pointed out that the woman from the school had marked her envelope with safeguarding in a different handwriting than the form that had used her photocopied signature, and that this would matter if anyone tried to claim I had misunderstood. And sometimes the strongest ally you can have is a person who knows how forms look when they are honest. I spent the late evening doing two things that look small and are not. I set up an old tablet at the end of the hall facing the front door and put it on a motion trigger app my granddaughter had shown me last Christmas when she was laughing at the cat, and I was pretending not to worry that apps would eat the house. And then I took 3 documents I did not care to lose, the old will leaving things equally, the building's insurance schedule, and the gas safety record, and I photocopied them and wrote in light pencil on the copies a fake filing note that read, "Originals kept in kitchen drawer under tea towels, because it is sometimes useful to let a person with quick hands find exactly what you want them to think is valuable." The originals went back into the black box in the loft, and the copies went into the kitchen drawer under the tea towels next to Mr. Patel's number plate note. And I went to bed for a few hours knowing that a trap is only worth setting if you have the patience to sleep while it waits for a foot. By morning I had a reply from Genesis that looked like it had been written by someone who learned politeness from a script, acknowledging my request and stating they would respond within 1 month unless the request was complex. And while the timing would not help me today, the acknowledgement itself told me that a file in my name existed inside their system, and that Mr. Daniel Barker had indeed been treated as a primary contact, which matters when a solicitor is explaining to a judge why consent cannot be an assumption. The bank complaints team replied with a case reference and a sentence confirming that pending third-party access had been suspended for 72 hours and that the scheduled client account transfer had been stopped pending verification. And I wrote these 2 facts in my ledger with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with not being moved off my own chair. At 9 I walked to the corner print shop to scan everything into a USB because the black box deserves a twin and because a file saved on a shop machine and emailed from a generic address is sometimes the safest copy you will have. The young man at the counter asked if I wanted them single or double-sided, and I said single with page numbers. And as the machine chattered, I felt the weight of stewardship that women like me carry without salary, and I steadied myself with the knowledge that I had never once lost an important receipt. On the way back, I stopped at the land registry office in town because the letter had provided a direct number and a name. And although the caseworker could not meet without an appointment, he did speak to me in reception and wrote a short note for me confirming that the restriction on my title remained in force and that any attempt to remove it without a solicitor's certificate would be rejected. And he put his initials and the date in the corner because he understood that paper with initials is a shield you can hoist to eye level when someone drives a red van through your boundary. When I turned onto Luckwell Road, The red van was not there and my gate was closed, which gave me 4 minutes to put the kettle on and move the tablets angled by 2 degrees so it would catch a hand if it reached into the kitchen drawer at a stretch. And then the bell rang twice in the rhythm of someone who believes being early is a right. I opened the door with the chain across because courtesy can stand behind a chain, and there stood a different courier with the same clipboard and a new story about end-of-day cutoffs and a manager who would be in trouble, and behind him, not pretending now, stood Tamsin with the pale coat and the soft voice and a man in a suit I did not recognize, but whose stance said compliance, and whose eyes went straight to the mantel where the brass key had hung before I moved it. I invited them to wait in the hall and I called out that I was just fetching my glasses and Alan coughed twice lightly in the pantry, and I took my time because haste is a gift to other people's timelines. "We only need the signature, lovely," Tamsin said when I returned, and her eyes flicked to the kitchen like a habit. "You said yourself you're tired of this admin. We're trying to spare you the back and forth." "I am indeed tired of admin that happens about me instead of with me," I said, keeping my hands open and still. "You will receive a letter from my solicitor within the hour. Until then, nothing leaves this house except on my say-so and through recorded channels." She smiled and stepped back half an inch, which meant she had not expected me to say solicitor in a way that matched a date and a name, and the man in the suit asked very politely whether he could at least take a copy to progress the file. And I said he could email his request to the address on the card from Kennett and Lowe, and that I would not be handing copies to a stranger without a data authority, and his eyes narrowed in professional irritation that told me he was not used to older women citing data authority on a doorstep before lunch. They left with less noise than yesterday and more annoyance, and I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down every word. 10 minutes later my phone buzzed with an email from Gareth to Genesis, copied to me and to their general counsel address, stating in crisp language that he acted for me, that all prior consents were withdrawn, that any reliance on a purported power of attorney was denied, that a safeguarding concern had been noted by a clinician, and that any further approach to me without him present would be treated as harassment. And the last line asked for immediate confirmation of destruction of any and signed deeds sent to my address, and I exhaled as if the email itself were a door handle I had been afraid to grab. The rest of the day swung between quiet errands and small tests of nerve. Eva messaged to say her mother had told her to bring my passport for the bank after school and asked whether I wanted her to pretend to forget, and I told her to leave it where it always lived and to come to me if anyone asked to search my bedroom. And she replied with a heart and a shaky thumbs up because children understand more than adults like to think. The nurse telephoned to confirm she had filed a safeguarding note with her agency and would be informing the local authority duty team that there was a risk of financial coercion. And she used measured phrases that sat cleanly on the page of my notebook and that would be hard to misinterpret later. And I thanked her for her professionalism, and she thanked me for not shouting, which said more about her week than mine. At 4, while the light in the hall made the door glass glow, there came a new knock, softer and faster, and when I opened it with the chain still on, a man I had never seen standing there gave his name as Browning, but not the same Browning, and offered me a business card for a different firm on the high street and said he had been asked by a client to assist with lodging because their usual witness had had to withdraw, and behind him I saw the red van in the next bay and the driver with his head down pretending to read a text. The second Browning asked if he could step in to talk through process and options, and I said I was not receiving visitors unannounced and he could leave any literature through the box, and his hand went halfway to the letterbox and then fell. And he gave me a look a person gives a machine that has stopped taking coins, and he walked back to the van and the driver said something I could not hear and they pulled away. I knew then that the next move had to be mine because I had held the line but only barely, and holding is not the same as turning. I called the bank again and asked to be put through to the vulnerable customer team rather than general service. And when the woman answered, I told her calmly that I had reason to believe a family member had misrepresented authority to staff and that an external company had attempted to remove a restriction from my property without my consent. And she asked me to describe dates and times and to confirm whether anyone had tried to take my identification documents, and when I said yes, she logged it as an incident and gave me a case number that began with VC and a string of numbers that I wrote carefully, and she offered to put a branch safeguard in place requiring me to attend in person with an independent witness for any change to my mandate. And I said yes and gave her Gareth's email as the independent party, and she said she would send a branch alert immediately. I telephoned Lucy while the kettle boiled and told her that Thursday might turn into something public, and she said she had brought forward her train and that she would be at the station by 9. And that she had already spoken to a friend who worked in adult social care in Glasgow who had texted her a list of phrases that made gatekeepers take you seriously. And I wrote those phrases on a post-it in my own words because I have never liked borrowed speech, but I do like the way particular nouns can open office doors. I took out the lemon bars I had frozen and put them on a plate because even in war, as my mother used to say in her quieter moments, you still feed the people who fight with you. Evening came and I told myself I would rest before Thursday, and I lasted 2 hours before the doorbell rang, not with insistence, but with speed, one quick press after another. And when I opened on the chain, a boy in a delivery hoodie held up a brown envelope and asked me to sign for a legal pack, and I said I would sign only if I could photograph the label and the return address and the QR code. And he said to suit myself and looked relieved, because it was clear he had been told to get a signature, but not to argue with an older woman behind a chain. I took the envelope into the kitchen and set it on the table and breathed through my nose until my hands steadied, and then I opened it. Inside was a thin bundle with a covering note from Genesis thanking Mrs. Barker for her promptness and asking her to sign the accompanying letter of intent to gift in advance of the deed to prevent family confusion, and on the last page someone had written in pencil a note that said, "Call before Mum's GP changes mind." And along the bottom margin was a number that matched the format of the bank reference I had written in my ledger. I turned the pages until I found it, a draft standing order to their client account, and in the margin in a different hand a small tick and the initials TB. I photographed every page and sent them to Gareth with the subject line "Arrived unsought this evening," and then I did something I would not have done last week because I would have thought it rude. I forwarded the covering note to the nurse with the single line, "For your file, evidence of pressure," and she replied in 6 minutes with "Received," and that was all I needed from her. Then I put the Genesis bundle in a large envelope and wrote, "To be opened in the presence of my solicitor only," and sealed it with brown tape and put it in the black box, because sometimes the safest place for a fire is inside a fireproof box. Night was quiet until it wasn't. At just after 11, the motion trigger app pinged and I opened the feed to see a hand slide under the tea towels and lift the decoy copies, and then move with quick certainty to the cutlery drawer where, perhaps, a quieter house would keep a passport. The hand wore a thin glove with a small tear near the thumb that showed a pale crescent of skin, and in the corner of the frame a sleeve with a neat pale cuff and a faint hiss of breath. And then the hand withdrew and the drawer closed and a shadow moved past the pantry door before the hall went still again. I stayed very still in the dark next to my phone and counted to 30, and then I called Alan, who answered on the first ring because men who have run housing offices and sit on councils sleep lightly. And I told him what the camera had seen, and he said he had it too, because he had set the device to sync to his phone as a backup, and he asked me whether I wanted to ring the police that night or wait to bring it to Gareth in the morning. And I said I would wait because I wanted one blow to land in the right room. Before I slept I checked the black box and my passport and the originals, and everything was as it should be. And then I went to the kitchen drawer and saw that whoever had reached under the towels had taken the pencil copy of the building's insurance and left the fake filing note. And I let out a sound that was not laughter and not crying and sat down on the cold chair and allowed myself exactly 1 minute of shaking hands before I stood and made a list of everything that now existed in duplicate. The tablet video. Alan's pantry camera audio. Mr. Patel's doorbell video. The nurse's safeguarding note. The land registry initials. The bank's VC case number. The Genesis covering note with the pencil line. The hand with the torn glove and the pale cuff. I woke before 5 and printed stills from the motion footage because in the morning people will tell you that what you saw at night was a dream, and having stills prevents that sentence from doing any damage. I put the stills in a folder marked Thursday, and I put that folder in my shopping bag because after everything I have learned about power, the bag that looks like it holds leaks is the safest way to move glass through a house full of stones. At 7, I put on my coat and walked to the bus stop for the early bus to town because I needed fresh copies made before the others woke. And on the way back as I turned into Luckwell Road, I saw the red van already there and Daniel leaning against it with his head down as if he were reading an important instruction, and Tansen standing by my gate with a set expression and a key in her hand that looked very much like my spare, and when she saw me she smiled and held it up and called out that she had found it under a cushion, and that she had been about to bring it back, and I walked up the path slowly and placed my shopping bag on the step and looked at the key not with anger, but with the kind of curiosity that makes a person ask a simple question. "If you found that key under a cushion," I said, keeping my eyes on her hand, "why is there a fleck of brown tape stuck to the ring?" Her smile did not move, but her eyes did, and Daniel straightened like a boy who has heard his teacher say his name, and the red van's engine turned over and then cut again, and Mr. Patel stepped out of his gate without pretending it was for the bin, and I reached into my bag and felt the edge of the folder under the leaks and the lemon bars. And from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure at the end of the street raise a phone the way people do when they film without wanting to admit they are filming. The photograph left under my door unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. It was not simply proof of Sophia's affair with Richard, but the fact that someone else had chosen to put it in my hands. Someone was watching them and, by extension, watching me. I did not know whether to feel threatened or supported. I took it straight to Thomas the next morning. He examined it carefully, then said, "This was taken with intent. Whoever left this wants you to act. That means you have more eyes on your side than you think." The question is whether we can use that in court or in another arena where Sophia cannot control the narrative. 2 weeks later, that arena presented itself. Sophia had arranged a formal dinner at James's firm under the guise of honoring his memory and cementing her new role as the guardian of his legacy. Invitations had been sent to partners, clients, and extended family. She positioned herself as the grieving widow stepping into responsibility, but I knew it was a calculated attempt to secure influence and perhaps even a trustee position that would give her direct access to funds. I told Thomas that was the stage we needed. He agreed, and we prepared meticulously. The night of the dinner, I dressed plainly but carefully. I wanted no one to think I had come for spectacle. The room was filled with polite conversations, glasses clinking, and Sophia circulating with Richard never far from her side. Lucas sat quietly next to me, bored and restless, while she introduced herself to wealthy men with exaggerated warmth. When the speeches began, Sophia rose first. She spoke of James's brilliance, of her commitment to continuing his charitable vision, and of the need for stable stewardship of the trust. Her voice carried the right notes of sorrow, yet her eyes scanned the room like a merchant assessing buyers. When she finished, Thomas stood. He had been asked by the firm to say a few words about James, but instead he turned toward the audience with a different expression. He spoke of integrity, of responsibility, of what it means to honor the dead not in words, but in actions. Then he gestured toward me. James left behind not just a son, but also his mother, a woman who stood beside him through every stage of his career. And he left behind clear instructions for how his legacy was to be protected. He paused, then unfolded a document from his case. The room stilled as Thomas explained that James had created a detailed guardianship plan, naming me as joint custodian of Lucas's inheritance with explicit restrictions on Sophia's access. He read aloud passages where James had expressed concern for the misuse of funds, passages written in his own hand. Gasps moved through the crowd. Sophia's smile faltered, but she tried to recover, interjecting, "That's a private matter, Thomas, not for tonight." Thomas ignored her and laid down copies of bank statements showing the transfers into Richard's company. The numbers spoke for themselves. Sophia's face strained of color as whispers filled the room. She tried to laugh it off. "Those are investments, legitimate, meant to secure our future." But then I rose slowly and placed the photograph on the table in front of her. The room leaned in as I said, "Investments or diversions for your own pleasures." Because the only future these show is the one you planned with him, not with James's son. Richard stood, attempting to defuse the moment, but a partner from the firm cut him off. We've reviewed those accounts. None of those transfers had authorization from James. You have some explaining to do, Mrs. Reynolds. The air thickened with judgment. Sophia stammered, reaching for the papers, but Thomas pulled them back. Then, as if fate wanted to seal the moment, Mrs. Alvarez, my neighbor, stepped forward from the crowd. She had not told me she would come, but there she was, holding her phone. She had photographs of Richard visiting Sophia's home late at night while Lucas was left with me. She projected them onto the screen meant for James's tribute video. Gasps turned into open murmurs. One client muttered, "Disgraceful." Another whispered, "And she wanted to control his trust?" Sophia's mask finally cracked. She shouted at me across the table, "You meddling old woman, you think anyone will believe you over me?" But the silence that followed told her everything. Even Lucas, frightened but firm, whispered, "I believe Grandma." His small voice carried across the room, and in that moment, the battle was lost for her. The partners announced an immediate review of all accounts linked to Sophia. Several family members approached me quietly, apologizing for doubting my concerns. Richard slipped out through a side door, abandoning her under the stares of 100 witnesses. Sophia tried to collect herself, but every movement betrayed desperation. For once, she had no script. The evening ended not with applause, but with the cold, unmistakable judgment of a community that had seen too much. Sophia was left sitting alone, her hands trembling, while I walked Lucas to the car. I had not raised my voice, I had not struck back, but every truth was now laid bare. And yet, as I buckled Lucas into his seat, I knew this was not over. Exposure was only the beginning. The real consequences were yet to come, and Sophia was about to learn what James had prepared long before his death. I stood at the table looking at the page with my name written in a shape that mimicked my hand and a witness line filled with a neat, "Mr. Browning." And for a long silent moment, I let the anger pass through without taking the lead, because I wanted my decisions to sit on solid ground. I rang Gareth and told him exactly what lay on my table, and that the kitchen drawer had been opened during a brief spell when I had been outside with my shopping bag, and that the decoy copies were gone, and that my spare key had just been returned with a fleck of brown tape on the ring, and he told me to bring everything at once and to stop speaking to anyone except him or the police, and I put the forged page into a clear sleeve and the stills from the motion camera into another, and I took the leaks out of the bag and slid in the folder marked Thursday, and I locked the front door and put the chain across and went out the back, because today I would decide the path and other people could follow it or not as they chose. At the solicitor's the air was steady and the carpets clean, and Lucy was already there with a notebook and a pen that made no sound and eyes that had decided not to blink until we had done what we came to do. And Gareth listened without interruption as I set the forged page on his desk and handed over Mr. Patel's door camera footage and Alan's pantry audio files and the tablet clip that showed the thin glove with the torn thumb reaching into my kitchen drawer and the still of the pail cuff and the sound of someone's breath as the drawer closed. And when I finished, he leaned back and said we would now move from politely holding lines to filing things that carry consequences. He dictated a short statement for me to sign that set out the timeline of the attempted deed of gift, the appearance of the TR1 transfer, the letters from Genesis, the scheduled bank transfer, the capacity screening that had recorded no clinical indication, the safeguarding note by the nurse, the land registry rejection for lack of a solicitor's certificate, and the document left on my table bearing a signature that was not mine. And he added a line about the spare key appearing with adhesive residue and a hand appearing on video inside my kitchen when no permission had been given, and he called a constable he knew on the neighborhood team and asked her to attend the office. And while we waited, he printed a letter before action to Genesis and a notification to the bank's fraud unit and a request to the land registry for a priority note on my title alongside the existing restriction. And he asked his clerk to book an emergency injunction application for the afternoon should the constable decide a crime report was warranted and should there be any risk to my home before the weekend. The constable arrived with a small recorder and a calm voice, and she took my statement again in her own words and watched the video stills one at a time and asked me to point to the torn glove and the cuff and the angle of the drawer. And she asked whether I wished to name the person I believed it to be, and I said that I would prefer to show her the second phone I keep for my granddaughter's school contacts, where a series of texts from my daughter-in-law asked for my passport and keys and that. An hour later, the drawer had been opened and the decoy papers removed, and she nodded and said it was sufficient to log the incident as a suspected burglary with intent to commit fraud, and that the recorded safeguarding report strengthened the context. And she took the forged page in a plastic wallet with gloved hands and placed a property label on it and signed across the seal. And she said she would visit my house that evening to confirm locks and to note the red van's number plate and whether it matched recent visits in the area, and then she asked me to forward the doorbell and pantry clips to the digital evidence portal so that she could attach them to the crime report. And when she left, my shoulders dropped because someone with powers I do not have had just agreed that what happened in my kitchen drew a line on the map. Gareth called Daniel from his office with the speaker on and introduced himself and stated calmly that he acted for me and that any further approach to my property would be treated as harassment and any attempt to remove a restriction or lodge a deed would be opposed. And he asked him whether he wished to attend a meeting at 4 to clarify intentions, because otherwise he would proceed on the basis of the evidence we had, and the bank would be served with a copy of the safeguarding notes and the video stills. And Daniel said loudly that this was a misunderstanding and that his mother was making things harder than they needed to be, and that Tamsin had tried to coordinate support, and that Genesis were reputable. And Gareth repeated that sentence with the tone of someone placing a stone on a pile for balance, and said we would meet at 4 and that Mr. Browning should attend if he wished to clarify his past involvement, and he ended the call without waiting for the familiar exhale of talk that follows a cornered man. Lucy set her pen down and asked me if I wanted water, and I realized I had not taken a proper breath since the kitchen drawer, and I drank the water and tasted only the metal of my own determination. We did not meet at my house because my kitchen had been turned into a place where other people had begun to act as if they had rights. So we met in the back room of Kennett and Lowe in front of a small table with 2 chairs on either side and a glass jug of water that no one touched. And at 4:02 Daniel arrived with a face set from a script, and Tamsin followed with her pale coat and a file of plastic sleeves, and behind them the first Mr. Browning, who had introduced himself as only a witness and who now carried a zipped portfolio with the embarrassment of a person who has just discovered his name is attached to a page that should not exist. Gareth began by asking the constable to identify herself and to confirm that the conversation would be recorded and that evidence would be shown and retained, and she did so with the same steady voice as before. And then he slid across the forged page and asked Mr. Browning to explain how his handwriting appeared on a witness line for a document he had not seen signed, and the man cleared his throat and said he had signed a cover sheet at the request of Genesis to expedite lodging, and had not noticed whether any signature was present on the page beneath, and that he accepted now that this had been improper, and the constable asked whether he had at any time witnessed my hand on a pen on that page, and he said he had not. And she wrote something in her notebook that made Tamsin sit very still. Gareth turned to Daniel and asked whether he had arranged for a third-party mandate on my account by video appointment, and if so, whether any bank employee had seen me sign or speak on that call. And Daniel said the bank had swept us through because of the LPA, and Gareth asked him to produce the registered LPA and the certificate provider statement and the Office of the Public Guardian registration number. And Daniel frowned and said that Genesis had handled the filing and that the registration was in progress, and Gareth placed on the table the email from the bank confirming that pending third-party access had been suspended and that any LPA would be treated as invalid unless the sealed registration was produced. And he added the letter from my GP deferring any capacity assessment, and then he played the short clip from the motion camera showing the thin-gloved hand lifting the tea towels and opening the drawer. And no one spoke for a full half-minute, because there are moments when truth wears the shape of a picture and the best you can do is look at it. Tamsin tried to recover first and said that families often muddle through paperwork and that mistakes happen, and that she had only tried to prevent confusion by drafting a letter of intent to gift, and that she had not asked anyone to sign anything without understanding. And Gareth placed the Genesis covering note on the table with the pencil line that read, "Call before Mum's GP changes mind," and asked her to read out the last 5 words, and she did so with a voice that tried to be small and failed. And then he asked her who had left the deed packet under my mat with a sticky note in her handwriting, and she said she had delivered it to save me a trip and that she now saw how that could be misinterpreted. And he nodded and said that misinterpretation was now the least of her concerns because the constable had logged a crime report and would be discussing with CID whether an attempt to obtain property by deception had been made and whether any forgeries had occurred in the presence of a professional witness. Mr. Browning asked if he might say something and then apologized directly to me for allowing his name to be attached to a page he had not seen signed and for bringing a witness pack to my home without verifying independent legal advice. And he said he would report the matter to his regulator and withdraw from any further involvement, and I thanked him for saying it plainly because plain words matter when papers have been sliding around your table without permission. Daniel began to speak about love and family and the wish to keep me safe and the fear that something might happen to me alone in the house, and I told him in a steady voice that nothing had happened to me until he started using words like activation and lodging and bringing strangers to my door, and that my safety had been secured by a brass key in a fireproof box and a restriction his father had placed 6 years ago because he must have suspected that one day tiredness or pressure might make me sign what I did not want to sign, and I added that the only person who had looked at me like a burden this week was him, and that it was not a look I intended to meet again. Gareth closed the meeting by sliding across 3 documents for signatures that were mine and only mine. The first appointed Lucy and Gareth jointly as my attorneys under a new lasting power of attorney for property and financial affairs, with a certificate provider who was neither family nor paid by my family, and who had spent an hour with me alone in the room that morning and written in his own hand that I understood exactly what I was doing. The second revoked all third-party mandates and named no one but me as a signatory on my accounts. The third was a fresh will that kept the equal division between Daniel and Lucy, but placed a condition on any distribution to Daniel that he complete a financial safeguarding course with the local authority and provide a letter of completion to the executors. And a separate letter of wishes, kept outside the will, left my first edition books and a small fund for education to my granddaughter Eva and a donation to the school safeguarding team whose envelope had brought the first crack of light into this mess. I signed with a slow hand that did not shake, and I said each signature aloud so the recorder would have the sound of my consent. The constable escorted us to the lobby where the red van sat across the street with its engine off and its driver staring at the floor. And she took down the number again and walked straight toward it in her bright jacket with the kind of focus that makes people put their hands on the wheel even when the engine isn't running. And the van pulled away a little too quickly, and she filmed it leaving on her body camera and later told me that the registered keeper had been warned about repeated nuisance visits to addresses on our road and would receive a notice, and that a regional investigation into doorstep probate sales had already logged Genesis as a company of interest, and that my evidence had been forwarded to Trading Standards with her report attached. We walked to the station where Lucy bought 2 teas and a pasty for me that I did not know I could finish, and I did. And on the platform, she took my hand and said she was proud of me, and I answered that I was tired of being careful in rooms where other people grew bold with my patience. And we both laughed a little because sometimes the only way to take back your ground is to describe exactly how you lost it. Over the next 3 weeks, the consequences unfolded in the quiet way that suits me better than a shout. The bank wrote to confirm the permanent removal of any third-party access and the placement of a branch note requiring my in-person approval witnessed by my solicitor for any future structural changes. And they enclosed a transcript from the video appointment in which a woman who was not me answered security questions in a careful voice while a second voice fed her the details off camera. And that file went to the constable who added it to the case with a note about possible fraud by misrepresentation. Genesis replied to Gareth's letter before action with a denial that did not survive his second letter. And within a week, they returned all fees to the account Daniel had tried to use and sent a withdrawal notice from my case, with a paragraph about retraining staff on consent procedures. And Trading Standards asked for permission to use my documents as part of a wider complaint, and I said yes, because if my quiet kitchen could help stop a stranger's quiet kitchen from being turned into an office for someone else's plan, then I would be happy to have the tea stains in their report. The residents' WhatsApp group posted an apology for the ambulance rumor and pinned a message about verifying information before sharing and added a link to the council page on safeguarding vulnerable adults, and Mr. Patel brought a pot of basil and a note with a joke that I pretended was not funny so he could tell it again. And the school safeguarding lead emailed to say the fake signature issue had been reported through the proper channels and that staff would be reminded never to allow copied signatures on consent forms. And she asked if I would consider speaking at a small training about how older residents can be targeted with paperwork, and I said yes if I could bring my binder and my USB and my lemon bars because sugar helps learning. The nurse sent me her final report with clean sentences that would stand up anywhere, and she added a short personal line that said it had been an honor to meet a woman who stayed calm in the face of pressure. And I sat with that line for a while because when people have been trying to describe you in paperwork, it is nourishing to read a sentence that sounds like the person you know yourself to be. Daniel called once to say that he was ashamed and angry in equal measure, and that he did not know how to explain to his wife that his mother would no longer sign things because that was how he had been solving problems for years. And I told him that no one had asked him to solve me, and that if he wanted to rebuild, then he would start by coming round without an agenda and with his phone left in the car and staying for an hour without suggesting any plans for my property, and that he could do that every Friday for a month, and we would see how it felt. And after a silence, he said he would. And the first Friday he came, he brought nothing but a packet of tea lights, because he remembered that I like the way a small flame makes the hallway feel welcoming. And I did not mention that we now had better locks and a chain and a motion camera, because trust is not the absence of precautions. It is the decision to keep showing up even when the kettle takes a while to boil. I changed my locks and registered for the free letterbox guard the police offer and placed a small notice on my door that said no doorstep sales or legal documents accepted, and I gave a key to Lucy and one to Mr. Patel for emergencies, and Eva came one afternoon after school and sat with me while I labeled folders for a workshop we planned at the library called Your Papers, Your Pace. And she practiced the sign-in process with her friend so we could time it and make sure no one would feel rushed, and I watched her shoulders relax when she realized there was nothing more to hide and no reason to keep her mother's plans in her phone like a hot stone. I wrote a letter to the office of the public guardian explaining why I had appointed my attorneys as I had and enclosed the certificate provider's statement and a copy of the safeguarding notes. And a month later the registration arrived in the post in a stiff envelope, and I placed it in the black box next to the brass key and the land registry restriction and the first photograph of our house when we were still painting skirting boards in our socks. I did not ask what happened inside Daniel and Tamsin's marriage because that is not where my dignity lives. But I know that the red van stopped appearing and the neighbors told me that Tamsin had been seen less often on Luckwell Road and that she had taken a job in a different town, and I know that Mr. Browning resigned from his firm and sent me a letter with a formal apology and confirmation that he had completed a professional ethics refresher. And I sent him back a short reply that said I appreciated his ownership and wished him steadier clients in future, and I mean it because when people take responsibility, it is possible to lay a small brick of trust between you. Trading Standards sent a thank you email with a line that read, "Your evidence contributed to wider enforcement," and I printed it and placed it behind a tab marked "After" because I like to keep the shape of endings clear. I began volunteering at the community center on Thursdays for a drop-in hour where we help older people read letters that make their hearts pound, and I bring my green binder and a spare pair of reading glasses and a plate of lemon bars. And I listen to sentences like, "My son says it's just paperwork," and "The bank said it was standard," and "They put things under my mat," and I show them how to write down dates and names, and how to ask for independent legal advice, and how to send a subject. access request without apologizing for existing, and when they leave I place a small card in their hand with the numbers for the local authority duty team and the police non-emergency line and the words, "You can say no and then say it again." And sometimes they grip my fingers just a little harder than necessary, and I let them, because that grip is someone stepping back onto their own floor. On the first Tuesday of the next month, I polished the handrail as always and thought of John and his careful square handwriting and his brass key and the black box he had built into the loft panel, and the way he had put protections in place without making me feel foolish. And I stood at the bottom of the stairs and said aloud that the house was still ours, and that the ledger was up to date, and that the kettle was always on for anyone who comes without a plan tucked into their sleeve, and the walls felt steady and the air felt honest. I walked outside and saw Mr. Patel watering his basil, and he tipped his chin the way he does when a thing is right again. And the post dropped through the guard with a soft thud, and I picked up a letter from the land registry confirming the note on my title, and I placed it under the magnet shaped like a tomato. And I thought that perhaps the best revenge I will ever know is a morning in which I can make tea, open my own post, and decide my own day without someone else's deadline knocking at my door. When people ask me what lesson there is, I tell them there isn't a lesson so much as a practice, and the practice is this: write things down, keep your papers where you can reach them, ask whose interest is being served every time someone says it's easier. Insist on advice that comes with a name and a date, and remember that leaning into a label like burden at the right moment can be the very thing that keeps your house standing, because sometimes the rules that control the powerful start working for you the minute you stop pretending that family always means safety. I do not speak that as a slogan because slogans have a way of floating off into the air. I speak it while I am filing bank letters and helping Mrs. Andrews from 4 doors down cancel a broadband package her nephew bought over the phone, and while I am handing Eva a slice of lemon bar across the table where she now does her homework and laughs again a little with her shoulder low. When I switch off the hall light at night, I check the chain and the new deadbolt and the small motion camera blink, and then I put my hand on the band drawer to remind myself that it is just a drawer, and I climb the stairs and the house makes its comfortable sounds. And sometimes there is a quiet minute where I wonder whether Daniel will ever sit at this table and say, "I was wrong," without the word, and I decide that I will keep the kettle ready for that day because I have nothing to gain by closing a door he may one day knock on without a clipboard. I sleep well now, not because harm has left the world, but because I have placed my own small barriers between other people's wants and my home, and I have a solicitor who answers his phone and a daughter who listens and a neighbor who films not to shame but to help, and a granddaughter who sent the first photograph that became a lantern in a dark hallway, and a ledger with VC case numbers and initials and dates, and a line at the bottom that reads, "House secure," and in the morning I can say it again out loud in a kitchen that belongs to me.